Welcome everyone. I'd like to start off by thanking Professor Atul Singh and the Shastrat Socratic Society for jointly organizing this evening's event. The Shastrat Socratic Society is the flagship student organization at IIT Gandhinagar that focuses on important issues, events, and trends of our time. The society regularly invites thought leaders from different walks of life to share their knowledge and insights with the audience. It has organized guest talks by the likes of Vapala Balachandran, who is the former chief of RAW, Manu Sharma, a former World Bank economist, and more recently, former General Officer Commanding in Chief PK Singh. Moving on to this evening's talk. For a long time now, the image of Africa has been reduced to photographs of starving children and ravaging wars. For too long has the history of the continent been invariably told by the civilizing white man. Our speaker for this evening, Mr. Shigoli Shitero, aims to change exactly this by bringing stories of Africa from Africa. Mr. Shitero holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Nairobi. His research concentrates on the relationship between corruption, institutions, economic inequality, as well as behavioral economics. When he's not busy conducting path breaking research, he spends time playing basketball and listening to classical music. And it does not take much to pin down that he's an incredibly enthusiastic individual with a biting sense of humor. It is my pleasure to introduce this young African scholar of great repute from none other than Kenya, the land of champions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Shigoli Shitero.
Hi, everyone. Um, Thank you, Meda, for your kind introduction. Um, I almost thought it wasn't me you're introducing. The faculty, Triple S, Professor Atul, I would like to thank you all for granting me this opportunity to be able to share um today's lecture on understanding the African story, the past, present, and the future. So first, I'll start by um, quoting a scholar, Hassan W. Marsh. Hassan W. Marsh says that um, the history of science is the history of the state, but memory is the science of the stateless. History is a science of the state, but memory is the science of the stateless. So why am I saying this? Um, so much has been said about Africa, and in truth, I would say that indigenous African history is rare to find. And this is because the African people rarely did have a written language. Yeah, most of the African tribes had they were vocal. Our stories were passed on through oral tradition, and memory served as the science of the stateless. So I'll start by asking, how many of you think that Africa is a beautiful state, is a beautiful country? By show of hands. Quite a lot, quite a lot. I'm about to disappoint you. Africa is not a country, right? That's the first lesson that you learned today. Africa is not a country, and I think that one now gives me the authority to be here, and it gives me the value for this talk, right? With that, I'm going to start my lecture with another picture. How many know her? How many know her? Okay, around 4 or 5 people, quite a few. Uh, I presume you have a very good environmental science faculty here. Like I've interacted with some people that are talking about the water reservoirs in India and all that. Her name is Professor Wangari Maathai. She's the 2004 Nobel laureate who was first described by the second president of Kenya as a very mad woman, right? She loved trees, she hugged trees. And today I'm going to start this lecture by quoting her. She said, "You cannot enslave a mind that knows itself, that values itself, and that understands itself." So, as we start this lecture, those are very strong words that you need to keep in mind as we go on. So, my lecture is going to be in three sections. The first section is about the pre-colonial period, which I call the saviors and the barbarians. The second part is the independence struggle and post-colonial period, which I term it as not yet Uhuru. Uhuru is a Swahili word to mean freedom, right? So not yet freedom. And the third part is about the modern day challenges and the future, which I tend to term it as come back, we need you, right? So up there, that's the pre-colonial Africa. You see how we used to live? Just a big piece of land with several kingdoms. No maps, no boundaries, no nothing. So how were boundaries made? Boundaries were made through conquest and wars. People used to move around in trade. People used to intermarry as the kingdoms show. And also trade, migration, and conquest were the hallmark of those kingdoms. And if you can see, they're very strategic. Most of them are located near rivers. Those are waterways for the trade and all that. And then something happened, right? They came, the missionaries and the explorers. They started touring around, the likes of Vasco da Gama, Christopher Columbus, and the rest. So in Kenya, actually, the missionaries started setting bay at around 1800s. And the funny thing is that when I was in school, and I was my history teacher actually asked me a question. Who was the first? We have a mountain in Kenya called Mount Kenya. So my history teacher asked me, who was the first person to see Mount Kenya? And we could recite it. There was a gentleman by the name Dr. David Livingstone. He was the first person to see Mount Kenya. So as I grew up and thought upon what that question really meant, and then I realized at that time there were people living around that area. Were those people not seeing that mountain? For me to be told that the first person to see Mount Kenya is Dr. David Livingstone. So you see, that's how the history of Africa has been distorted, and that's how it has been told across the world, and that's how we have been taught as we grow up too, by the books which are written, especially, or of course, by them. So that is the Africa before the Berlin Conference of 1884. And the Berlin Conference was the hallmark of the scramble and partitioning of the Africa, right? So this is where a bunch of colonialists, white power people, sat down, led by the German chancellor of that time, Otto von Bismarck, to divide Africa. They had a map, they had this map, and then they sat down and decided, let's cut this piece of cake amongst ourselves, right? So there were several reasons that led to that, right? There were economic reasons. there are political reasons, and there are social reasons, social cultural reasons. So the economic reasons, I think in my case, were much more paramount. Because at that time, there was booming industrialization in the States, and they needed raw materials. They needed rubbers for their tire industries and all that. So they decided, and the missionaries and explorers had told them about there's a place down there which has huge tracts of land, and it's very fertile, and its inhabitants seem very confused. To quote them, they used to call them savages and barbarians. Thus, my title of saviors and barbarians. So they used to call Africans, they used to call us barbarians. So that necessitated them to sit down and say, okay, let's go and civilize those barbarians. So in that essence, among it was economic factors were what drove them there. They wanted to expand their markets too for those barbarians, from those barbarians. I don't know how they are going to buy their things. So another reason which I highlighted was political reasons. So the British Empire was expanding, and they wanted to expand it more. Also, the Germans had just come out of the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, and they had defeated the Germans had defeated the French. And you know, when you defeat someone, you want to go and conquer more because you feel like you are indispensable. So they did that, and that's why that gave them the reason to come and divide the African cake. The French also were deeply wounded, and they wanted to rebuild from their loss in the Franco-Prussian War. And there are also sociocultural reasons, and this is they wanted to come and civilize us because we were uncivilized barbarians, and also to spread Christianity. One thing you need to know is that before they came, Africa had kingdoms. Among the kingdoms, we know of the Mali kingdom. We know of we have a Mali kingdom, Asante kingdom, I think in Ghana. We have the Monomotapa kingdom in the southern Africa, the Zimbabwe kingdom. And Africans were not barbaric. Africans were among the first civilized people, right? There's a place called Timbuktu in Mali where scholars came. It used to have an university. I think the first university was in Timbuktu, right? Scholars used to come to Mali. Even now, there are archives there of great scholars like Ibn Khaldun, who came to Mali to study, and the spread of Islam through that belt of top sub-Saharan Africa in Mali and everywhere. So we were not barbarians. Our barbarianism was a creation of the white person so that to come and subdue and colonize us, right? So after all that 1884 sitting and everything, this is what they came up with, right? Quite beautiful, right? They were very artistic, to say the least, because I don't know how I would have come up with a map of Kenya. It has a very nice shape. So this is how they divided the partition, the continent, right? The French took the west side up north. The British were very strategic. They took very strategic places across the oceans and down south, right? And the Germans also took some few places in present-day Namibia, in Tanzania, and also in Cameroon. The Italians had Ethiopia, and the Spanish, I think, yeah, the Italians had Eritrea and Somalia and Libya. And actually, there were two countries which were not colonized, and Liberia and Ethiopia. And Liberia, it's because it was a dumping point for the ex-African American slaves. After they were released from America, they were dumped in Liberia. So that's how Liberia grew up as a state, and it wasn't colonized. And Ethiopia, on the other hand, Ethiopia actually they defeated the Italians in battles, so that they weren't colonized because of that. So now, when they divided it and they decided to come to Africa after the 1884 conference, one of the first things they did is they created railways, right? And I wish I had the map, but the railways in Africa are created were built in such a way that they were just extractive instruments, because the main agenda was economic extraction, and the railways actually, they were not linking up different places. All of them used to begin from the coastal line, the oceans, and they come to the hinterland, right? So they were basically made for the raw materials to be extracted from the interior of the continent or interior of the different countries, which are protectorates after the partitioning. And then they were taken to the coast and then shipped off to their colonies. So the funny thing is, even now, when us Africans, we build our new railways, that's the model we use. They're still very extractive, actually. We build railways to link up oil fields and the port. We'll build railways to link up very resource areas, mines and the port, because we still have that colonial mentality of extractiveness, right? Because we're not linking up, we're not building a railway to link up, let's say, different cities because of movement of people. No. The first thing that informs our construction of railways is, are there natural resources there? Yeah. We need to mine that. Okay. Where are we taking it? We're going to export it for as raw materials to wherever we're going to export it to. So what do? We come up with a big conceptualization of a funny railway with funny kinds of designs, and then goes into the hinterland and takes out the minerals and everything, and takes out to the coastal areas and ships it out. And that's the nature, right? That's the psychology that was put into the African mind by the colonial people, and unfortunately, our leaders also have seamlessly gotten into it. So when they came, people were not happy because they displaced, because their main aim, they had thought of the land that they had seen, which was very fertile, but this land was inhabited by people. So they came in and displaced the people from the lands. They sent them into native reserves. We call them native reserves because they were concentrated into different areas which are not fertile, as they were sitting on their fertile lands. So this thing actually, it brought discontent, right? And when these white people came, they didn't come with labor, right? That's the first thing you need to know. They didn't come with labor. First thing, they came, and now after they have arrived and have taken over the lands, and they sat down and thought, like, now, how are we going to get on from here, right? Because first you have sent away the natives, and now you have a piece of land, but now you don't have people who are going to work on that land, no one to cultivate the land. So they thought, and they're very ingenious, and decided that the natives, after taking their land, they're going to be paying taxes to them so that they can administer the land, right? So this was quite an unfortunate situation, and these natives actually didn't have money, of course, because they were used to barter trade at that time. Now, and then they were very ingenious. They're like, okay, you don't have money, sure. So what if you work for us, and then we will pay you so that you can pay the tax? So that's actually what happened, and that's how the exploitation worked, right? So you are first removed from your land, concentrated in a different area, and then somebody tells you to work and then pay him so that he can administer the land that is stole from you, right? So, and the British were very good at this, right? Actually, let me point out that different colonialists had different ways of administering their rule. The British mostly used divide and rule, and then they used indirect rule, like in areas like in Nigeria. In Nigeria, it was an amalgamation of more than 150 tribes, right? But um, they picked around 4 tribes: the Hausa and Fulani from the north, I think the Igbo from the east, and the Yoruba. And they used those kingdoms, there are kingdoms actually, they used those kingdoms to administer the Nigerian state on behalf of the British. So those leaders of those kingdoms were working on behalf of the British. So they were suppressing all other small tribes in that kingdom. So the same thing was happening in Kenya, whereby there were a group of local leaders who were made paramount chiefs to administer the colony on behalf of the British, who used the Imperial British East African Company to rule the continent, the indirect rule. So with that, and during that time, some things happened. There was the World War II, the World War One, and then the World War II. And at the same time, schools began to come up in those colonies, and some Africans were privileged to go into those schools, and they went abroad to study. So as this was happening, in the world wars, Africans were conscripted into the colonial powers regiment, right? So now, apart from somebody stealing your land, he has taken you to go and fight his wars, right? So when Africans were taken into these regiments to fight, many of them were killed, of course, yeah? But it brought some realizations to their minds. And I'm coming to my slide now. The independence struggle was fueled by growing Pan-Africanism and growing economic exploitation and restriction of movement, and the USSR and the USA Axis and the Cold War, and the United Nations Charter on Self-Determination. Let me explain them. With the education of indigenous African people and those who went to the United States, like Kwame Nkrumah, and then we have Jomo Kenyatta, who went to the UK to study, and we have Tom Mboya, who went to the US to study. These people, when they came back, they had, like Kwame Nkrumah had inspiration from Gandhi. He had read a lot about independence movement. He had read about the rights movement, and he was there actually. Even we have Tom Mboya from Kenya, who was there with Martin Luther King in some of the rallies. So these people were enlightened, right? And when they came back to their countries, they wanted to have self-determination and self-rule because they have seen it's possible. So at the same time, when those people who are in the World War fighting, when they came out, they realized that, oh, this mystic creature who came and took our land can also be killed, because they saw them being killed in the world wars. So they thought that this person, wait a minute, this person is not that indispensable. We can also kill him. So they also started agitating, albeit violently, for their independence. So there are two groups, right? We have the educated fellas, and then we have those militant guys trying to agitate for independence. And at the same time, the factors were the economic exploitation, because they were forced to pay taxes, their land was taken, and then you are concentrated into camps, whereby if you leave that camp, you have to hang your identification on your neck to move around. It was very humiliating to them, right? Because it's a land that you're used to walking around free, but now somebody is telling you that you need to put on a very big, we used to call them kipande in Kiswahili in Kenya, their identifications, right? tells you where you are, who are you, where you come from, and all those things. And also another thing is that the US and the USSR, they were against colonialism at that point, right? They were more pushing for self-determination and self-rule for these African states. And also in the formation of the United Nations, they had a charter on self-determination. So, as I said, the struggle was two-pronged. We had the armed wings, like in Kenya, we had the Mau Mau. In Tanzania, we had the Maji Maji rebellion. We had in South Africa, we had the Umkhonto weSizwe, which was a part of the African National Congress, the military part. They had the military part and the political wing. In some areas, the party movements had different different wings or different parts. They had armed wings, youth wings, and all those. But in Kenya, we had the Mau Mau fighting separately, and then we had the political parties like the Kenya African Union, which actually, through Kenyatta, they opposed the tactics employed by the Mau Mau. So you can imagine, you are having the same struggle, but someone else is not liking your modes of going about it, and you have lost your land. So this as we'll see later on, was a cause of many problems. And in political wings in Ghana, we had Kwame Nkrumah, who actually led through violent protests and strikes, and they bore fruit. And Ghana was the first sub-Saharan country to gain independence in 1957. And also, with that, the writing was on the wall for the colonialists. After the World War II, they spent so much resources on the World War II, so they were kind of also wanted to rebuild and focus on their nations because they couldn't manage their own issues, on their own economy, and at the same time manage to rule over another continent. So what did they do? I think at that point they wanted to give up the continent, and that is seen by the 1960 speech by Prime Minister Harold Macmillan in the Union of South Africa in Cape Colony, where he said that the world should be cognizant of a rising bunch of nationalists from Africa. And those nationalists, what they're asking for is self-determination and self-rule. And and as colonialists, we should be able to heed their call, or else history will judge them very harshly. And at the same time, he implored upon the South African apartheid government to tone down on some of the apartheid strategies and all that. So from that 1960 speech, many African countries became independent, like in that decade of 1960 to around 1973, 1975. Many African countries, there was a wind of independence in Africa. And also in 1963, with those educated nationalists, they came together and formed the Organization of African Union. That was the first organization of African unions, so that it can agitate for the independence of the countries which had not gotten independence yet. And at that time, the African Union had a signatory members of around 32 countries had signatory to that. So at the same time, we talked about the Cold War, whereby pressure was still mounting by the USA and the USSR. And it should be known that these people mounting that pressure, it's not because they wanted the good for us, right? It's because they wanted these people to go out so that the cake can be free again, they can come in for themselves, right? So in that case, people had different, there was an ideological war during that time, at the same time as the Cold War. And Africa was the playground, right? Because these are new states coming up, they have gotten independence, so we want to sway them to be our allies. So Washington wanted to sway them into capitalism, and Moscow wanted to sway them into communism and socialism. So there was a tag there, and actually it cost the lives of many African leaders, because like if the Western world, you seemed to be very nationalistic, and you had, because these nationalistics, what they wanted is they wanted the resources for Africans should be left in Africa, and the Africans should be able to benefit from their own resources. They also they had nationalistic policies like nationalizing those mines and all that for the benefit of the country. So their visions were more welfare, but the Western world didn't want that. The Western world wanted a piece of that cake, right? They wanted a piece of that cake, and these people were the impediments for them getting into that piece of cake. So that led to deaths and assassinations of many leaders who were opposed to the Western way of doing things. And also there were coups. Actually, I think there were 40 coups in the decade after independence. That's from around 1960 to around 1970, 71. There were around 40 coups organized by the CIA, the MI6, and all other Western countries. So it brings me to my second section, which is not yet Uhuru. Now we are at a point that we're independent now, right? We are trying to build these young states, but at the same time we are facing other problems, right? We realize that we are really not free, right? Because the first map, you remember I showed you, it didn't have boundaries, right? So now we're in a situation whereby we used to have the Buganda kingdom here, but now it has been divided with some of the kingdom in Uganda, some of the kingdom in Kenya. So there's conflict here, right? Because these tribes which existed in this continent have been amalgamated artificially and boundaries drawn on them without knowledge of the internal demographics or ethnographic composition of these states. So that itself is a source of conflict, right? And then, like in Nigeria, there were these tribes or kingdoms which were empowered by the British to administer the indirect rule. So they felt they were so superior from the rest, right? And this is a country, it's an artificially made country of over 200 tribes. So in 200 tribes, you find that there are 3 or 4 tribes which feel that they can rule over fellow Africans. So that brings up problematic issues and conflicts. So, and also the Cold War was still going on as usual, and the pressures were still on. And these 3 points bring out the internal and the external effects or challenges after the independence, right? So in Kenya, for example, the Kikuyus, they believe they fought for independence, right? And so actually out of the 4 presidents we've had in our country since independence, 3 of them have been Kikuyus, right? So that's how much they feel entitled, and it's not a good thing actually, because it has brought conflict, and some people think that they are being victimized, that people think they're superior to the others. So those are the problems that came with independence. And in the Kenyan case, and actually where I get the title Not Yet Uhuru, it's because in Kenya, the independence was given to the political guys, right? When the militant group, the Mau Mau, which actually was known as Kenya Land and Freedom Army, but I think the white person is the one who came up with the Mau Mau. They were called because they used to take oaths and all that. So they were agitating for land freedom. Uh, so they were in the forest, in the caves, and then we have this political wing led by the Kenya African Union, which became Kenya African National Union. So it had leaders like Oginga Odinga, James Gishuru, and at that time Jomo Kenyatta was in jail because he was thought to be one of the leaders of the Mau Mau. So the British wanted to give independence to Kenya, and that was the political group that was going to be handed over independence, the same way it happened to Ghana when Kwame Nkrumah was handed over the independence. But there was a leader by the name of Oginga Odinga who refused and said, we can only accept independence if Kenyatta is also freed, right? So that's how these guys are very nationalistic, and that's how they liked each other in the struggle. So then the white person decided, okay, sure. After the trials of Kenyatta and 5 other people, Kenyatta was released, and then Kenya was given independence, and then Kenyatta became the prime minister, then the president, and then Oginga Odinga became the vice president. So Oginga Odinga was more Eastern leaning. He was more of a communist, right? Kenyatta was UK educated and more of a capitalist, but also had traveled to Russia several times. So at this point, there was a clash of ideologies, right? Because now we have gotten this independence we wanted. So this is how we're going to do. There are these people who are in the forest who their land was taken away, they were displaced. So we need first to give them their land, and that was Oginga Odinga's thinking in a process of Africanization. But Kenyatta had other ideas, right? No, those ones are there, let them be there. So here we have pieces of land. So it's time we're going to enrich ourselves. So a group of people started enriching themselves with that land. And Oginga felt very much betrayed, and that went on, and a group of elites came up, and actually Frantz Fanon calls them comprada bourgeoisie, who decided to steal and appropriate the good land which had um, been left by the whites who had gone, and they started like self-aggrandizement, and this actually did not go well with Oginga Odinga, and they had conflicts with the president, and he was fired as the vice president and became the first opposition leader in Kenya. And in 1967, that's when he wrote the book, It's Not Yet Uhuru. Like, he thought they had freedom, but we were not there yet, right? That's why I get the heading. And this thing did not happen only in Kenya. It's not a unique case in Kenya. It's something that happened all over Africa. Like, there was a group of people who, after the countries got independence, they decided to enrich themselves. In short, they decided to reward themselves after the struggles and all that. And it happened with Mobutu Sese Seko in Congo after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. In Ghana, after the exile of Kwame Nkrumah, the new state became very corrupt. In South Africa, some of the African leaders who are fighting apartheid, after the end of apartheid, they are the richest people right now. Like the current president, I think he's a beneficiary of of the indigenization of the mines. He's a very wealthy fellow, actually, right? And so the Pan-African dream actually died because these people became very capitalistic and materialistic, right? So they didn't care about the Pan-African dream or what the nationalists, the founding nationalists, um, had envisioned, and this is because these nationalists actually most of them were assassinated, some of them exiled and some of them were deposed through coups. So, and also the politics of the internal politics were reorganizing, right? So, like in Kenya, the politics became a patron-client kind of politics. Like the person who is the president controls the resources and therefore decides which which part of the nation benefits from it. So it becomes a very chronic capitalistic kind of a setup which was not furthering the ideals of the founding Pan-Africanists. And as you can see there, by 1973, 6 African leaders or independence heroes had been assassinated. And Patrice Lumumba, with the help of MI6 and CIA, Felix Mounier of Cameroon, Sylvanus Olympio of Togo, Mehdi Ben Barka, who was abducted in France, Eduardo Mondlane through a plane crash, Amilcar Cabral also, as in by the Portuguese. So it was either you are with us or you disappear. That's the kind of politics which was there. And actually it was perpetuated by the white man. So this shows you that we were not really independent, thus the philosophy of not yet Uhuru, right? So now we go to the post-Cold War legacy, because at this point, with the new crop of the bourgeois who have come up, the political beneficiaries of the resources of the African states, they actually had protection through this Cold War period, because they had the leverage of bargaining with these two superpowers of Moscow and Washington when they're feuding, and the African guys in the middle. So he could oppress his people, and when it comes up, as the Moscow guy wasn't mad as long as the leader is allied to him. So it doesn't matter what that person is doing in the country internally. It doesn't matter if he's not working for his people, if he's killing people there. And at this point, when the Cold War ended around 1989, 1990 period, there are things which started happening, right? One of them was the US started reorienting its foreign policies. Before that, it only wanted alliance with those new African states. But now it was like, oh wait, it started preaching the gospel of democracy. And you know, at that point of Cold War, many African countries became one-party state. Like Kwame Nkrumah, when he was still president, he was asked by a friend of his, and I think he was a secretary in the cabinet. He asked him, like, why do you want to have a one-party state? And he answered him, Dr. Asante, I think we have created institutions, we have a country, but now the problem is we don't have enough skilled people who can run these institutions and this country. The people who can run this country and this institution are in the opposition. So if I create a one-party state, I will bring them in, and so they'll be able to work I'll be able to tap into those skilled labor. So those are some of the weird reasons given for perpetuating the one-party state. In Kenya also there was a one-party state, and before the 1982 coup, there was a dominant one party with Oginga Odinga as the opposition leader, but he was a very inconsequential opposition leader because the KANU, the Kenya African National Union, was a dominant party. So at the same time, so when the US was preaching the democracy gospel and the human rights gospel, things were changing in Africa at that time after the Cold War. And also there were civil wars coming up because the politics of Africa was managed and created and sustained with money, right? It was a patron-client politics. Like, I have money, I can bring people close to me, and I can dish them money, and these people will go to their people and give them money. So they were working on a trickle-down kind of concept to ensure that there is stability and all that. But now we have a situation whereby that money that they used to get from the USSR and the USA is no longer there because they are no longer darlings after the Cold War, right? So they are left exposed. And so now a new order ensues, and that is when the US decides to preach on the democracy gospel and all that, and the Bretton Woods institutions decide to tie the knot on them. And then comes to my third and final part, that is, come back, we need you. And at this point, in 1990s, something comes up, and this is called the Structural Adjustment Program period, right? And this was basically from shifting foreign objectives. And the US actually were giving, Africans were having problems, yeah? Because they didn't have money. They were used to money from the Cold War, AIDS and all that. But now they don't have money, but the US wants to give them money. The IMF and the World Bank wants to give them money, but they're going to give them money if and only if they do as they want. So this is another part whereby the colonialism spirit is being perpetuated, right? Because now it has moved from the political occupation and physical occupation to now economical and imperialistic kind of colonialism. And they used something called the Structural Adjustment Program, a very powerful tool, which actually meant that there were many, a list of things that Africans were supposed to do before you get money. And that included market liberalization. You have to privatize your state institutions. So that is, you're moving away from the nationalistic politics. And then you have to privatize the state institutions and also the resource extractions. So this opened the doors for companies to come in to do the extraction, and that's where actually Africa started losing it and lost control of those mines and everything. So in the market liberalization and trade liberalization, we see that it's quite unfair because an African farmer is forced to trade in the same market as an American farmer. And an American farmer who has done mechanized farming in huge tracts of land with government subsidy brings their good to the market, and then an African farmer who is basically subsistence and with poor farming technology also brings their goods to the market, and they're supposed to compete for the market at the same time, which was very unfair. And this is some of the things that actually led to underdevelopment in Africa. And so trade became the new instrument of submission in Africa. So even with the formation of the WTO in 1995 to catalyze trade relations. So WTO is a round of the World Trade Organization, has a round of negotiations on trade matters of countries. So we find that one of the sticking issues that Africans have been negotiating on that table is that some of these countries, like the US, should stop subsidizing their farmers because they create an uncompetitive culture that you can't compete with them. If they are subsidized, they can come to the market and sell their goods at 1 rupee and they still make their money. But you, considering your costs and everything, even if you come and sell your goods at 10 rupees, you still don't make money, right? So that was the unfair and unbalanced situations coming on. And these guys, they know that. They know what they were doing. So that's why they build these organizations to subdue you, right? And that's what Africa has been going through. And actually, this trade is romanticized, right, by scholars. They say trade is good for you. You don't need aid. You just need to be helped to trade. At the same time, the trade is through unfair competition, unfair policies, unfair negotiating terms. So we see that with the structural adjustment programs and the World Trade Organization, negotiations not favoring Africa. So a new era of neo-imperialism was high in gears, right? So, and then something else happens, right? In all through that confusion of the states trying to come in and get the pie of Africa through these instruments of Bretton Woods and WTO and all this, the dragon comes in. And the dragon in this case is the Chinese. So the Chinese come in with a new model, right? And we welcome them with this new model of no conditions. They come in and they give you, they come in, you tell them what you want. I want a railway to be built. Oh, they say, okay, no problem, come. You go, they'll do a feasibility study for you. They'll bring labor for you from China. They'll organize funding for you. And they'll ensure they put in a small kickback for your pocket. So this is a new model which the African leader was like, oh, this is going to help me to continue to maintain my patronage relationship, right? So China, with this model, managed to elbow out the US and the UK, and China now became the new darling of the African leaders. And actually, in Kenya, we had a philosophy known as facing east, right? We were just facing east. It's China and India. Actually, right now, I think China is the highest investor in Africa, followed by India, because they don't ask so many questions, right? Not like the Western world where you ask them for money and they'll tell you, oh, first of all, you need to make sure that you have this policy in place, or what, this structure in place, or you have to have this institution in place. No, it's not like that. So Chinese entry into Africa created a model of funding that the West could not match. They conceptualized a project, often huge infrastructure ones, did the feasibility study, organized funding, and build it to the end. So the country will just sign for funding. So the job that you did was just go, sign for funding and repayment and kickbacks to the ruling elites. And this is committing the taxes of your countrymen to these projects, right? So actually the Chinese-Africa relations have grown tremendously, like since 1998, which were estimated at around $70 million. Now they're estimated at around $200 billion in a period of like 20 years, I think, or less. So that's how huge, and that's how Africa likes free money, right? So the Chinese actually take, they usually take natural resources, the mines, the oils, as security for their loans. Right? So they give you money, but you give them a concession to mine. So they come in, they mine, and then they take them to China, to their factories in China. So this is actually very notorious in Angola. Angola is a petrostate in southwest Africa, and there's actually a group called the Futungo Group. This is a group which was around the former president Eduardo dos Santos, whose daughter is the richest um, African female. Yeah, is the richest African female, and it's a petrostate. So in Angola, there's a group of company. There's a company called the Queensway Group, yeah, which was led by some Chinese fella called Sampa, very notorious fella who is very known for the oil deals and mining deals in Africa. So the Futungo Group, through the the Angolan parastatal of oil, they form a consortium of companies with that Queensway Group, and then they give them concessions to mine their oil. In exchange, they get money, and also they build cities for them, they build railways, they build estates. And actually, Luanda, the capital city of Angola, is one of the most expensive places to live in the world. Like, I can't afford to live there. You can't afford to live there because the cheapest you can pay rent there is around $3,000, $5,000 for, I think, a one-bedroom house. So it's quite expensive because of the oil money and everything, right? So this is how the new maps of Africa look like now, right? With we are painting the map red after the white man came, the colonialists came, and we sent them away. Now we are having a new one coming, and this one we're embracing wholeheartedly. This one is our darling because it gives us money without talking, right? And you can see on the other map that the places where how China has been doing its business, right? It gives you loans, but this is what it takes. It takes either the mineral rights, it takes the oil rights, and some areas it takes oil and mineral rights, right? So this is another way of losing sovereignty. And as this one goes on, we find that these African states, they become so indebted, right? Like in Kenya right now, 50% of the debt we're paying it to China, right? That shows you how bad this situation is. And so, like any debt mill, it reaches a point where it becomes an endpoint. So what do we do when we reach an endpoint? We decide to go back to the original lenders, right? So we decide to go back to the original lenders, and at this time they are willing to embrace us, right? And they come up with ways, a new politics and a new foreign policy, and this, I think, in 2014, that's when it really came out so well, when President Obama welcomed dictators to White House in what was known as the US Africa Leaders Summit in August 2014, right? And this point, like, these are people who are fighting for democracy and human rights. And at this point, Obama invites leaders who have been oppressing their own citizens, and they have been presidents for over 30 years, for 20 years, right? And this signaled a shift in policy by the US, because they were losing. The map was being printed red, and they're not in the party, so they need to come back in the party. So now let's come back to the table and start again. And this summit actually was to discuss trade, investment, and security in Africa. So this signaled an official turn of a foreign policy, and it worked to empower state capture by African oligarchs, since the big brother is now blind, right? So the people that we looked up to help us in our democratic problems and human rights issues decided to be blind now, because he also wants a piece of the cake, which China is having so well. So the US are quite desperate, actually. Even they worked with France in the 2011 elections of Niger. Niger is a petrostate too. Yeah, it's borders the Sahara Desert and borders, I think, Nigeria on the southern side, and it's immensely endowed with oil. So they wanted a friendly leader, and that's how the new age is coming now. They're even sponsoring leaders. Previous time they used to assassinate you, but now they're even sponsoring leaders. So like President Mamadou Issoufou, who is the current president of Niger, he was before he became president, he was the Secretary General of a French-owned Somalia mining company, right? So this is complete conflict of interest, right? Because this guy has worked for a French company, and now he's going to be a president of this country which has so much oil, and these French are very much interested in this oil. So this is how the state now is going to be like, and the US are backing this one now, right? Because they want to counter the Chinese influence in Africa, right? So another tool that the US come up with is terrorism, right? So if you have noticed, with recent years, like the battleground for terrorism is shifting, right? It's shifting from the Middle East and everywhere. It's now, we're having our frontier in Kenya because we're bordering the Somali because of the Al-Shabaab. And also we are having they're saying there are traces, even in Kenya right now, we are being told Somalia, there are traces of ISIS in Somalia, right? So, and also in Libya, being told the ISIS in Libya, we have Boko Haram in Nigeria, and then we have the Mali. Recently, we had the terrorism attacks in Mali, right? And also the French put on their boots in Mali recently. So something new is happening here, right? So not just we want trade, but we are going to go in all corners, right? And this comes after the summit on trade, investment, and security. And this is the security discussion, right? It's all about terrorism. And I would say that this terrorism, actually, it's the new Cold War Kool-Aid, right? Whereby countries can get away with anything in the name of being strategic ally in fighting terrorism. Like during the Cold War, we saw that these countries could suppress their people, could kill people, assassinations could happen by those African leaders, and nothing was done unto them. Because as long as he's our ally, we're going to overlook that one. And now we're in another situation whereby, as long as he's our ally in this fight against terrorism, then the rest, we're not that keen. As long as the country is stable and he's our ally. And this actually is very well, and it was very well reflected in last year's Kenya's election, right? So in Kenya, this was extended further to internal affairs, where the US ambassador supported a botched election twice, right? Exercised in 2017 twice, and later went on a charm offensive of inviting the opposition party to form a coalition government with the incumbent side to avert a crisis and maintain stability. So you see now here, there's that new doctrine of stability coming in. So it doesn't matter if there's democracy. It doesn't matter if there's human rights. As long as the country is peaceful and we can do business, it's okay, right? Because in that, the first election happened, and then even actually I think a month or 2 months before election, or a month before election, the US signed a very big deal of around $3 billion with the Kenyan government, right? And you see, that's a big deal because you are in the cold. Now somebody is bringing you into the Cape, right? You're signing a very big deal of $3 billion to construct a road. So, and then an election happens, and then it was marred with the irregularities, and then the Supreme Court nullified the election, and then ordered another election in 60 days. During those 60 days, one of the officials of the Electoral Commission resigns. Another one says, the chairman of the Electoral Commission says that I cannot guarantee free and fair elections. This is the chairman who's supposed to guarantee the free and fair elections. He's telling you that he cannot guarantee free and fair elections. But the US ambassador is coming out and saying, I'm very happy with the preparations for these elections, right? So you see that shift in these people who don't care. They just want to do business, right? It's as long as these people are okay, let's do business. So the elections go on. People, the opposition party boycotted the elections. They were very dismally, they performed very dismally actually. Very few people went on to vote, but the numbers were spruced up. And after that, the ambassador went on a charm offensive and trying to bring the opposition after the mistake has happened now, bringing them together. You need to sit down and talk about this thing. The country is bigger than, or that there's a very good phrase and narrative going on in our country that the country is bigger than you to cool you down so that you don't do nasty things, right? The country is bigger than you and all that. So that now, I would say the opposition leader is actually very much against Kenya's incursion into Somalia, because Kenya entered into Somalia to maintain stability in Somalia because of the Al-Shabaab. And you see now that's a fight that you're fighting, which is not your war. You're fighting a terrorism war, which is the US terrorism war. So you are a proxy in this war. So the incumbent president is supporting that war, which is in line with what the US want, right? But the opposition leader was like, no, we need to bring our troops home because they are being killed there. There are massacres which are happening in Somalia of our troops. So, and that brings me to another tool that is being used for neocolonialism, which is called neoliberal psychology, right? And the neoliberal psychology, right, to the neocolonialists, it's like it conceptualizes the African continent as a big market, right? It conceptualizes the African continent as a very big market. That's why you hear about stories of Africa rising. How many has heard of Africa rising? Anyone who has heard of Africa rising? Yeah, there are these narratives being told around that Africa rising, Africa is the new frontier market. It's all neoliberal stuff. Like, they're saying that so that they can come in and have a piece of the cake, right, without caring. And with that, you're not supposed to cause trouble when you're being told African rising, right? So the populace has been battered for long since colonialism. It has lost hope and lacks imagination of the future, such that an injustice can only be wished away so as we go back to normalcy, right? So with that neoliberal concept turning you into a market instead of a human being, if I see you, I'm saying, okay, I can bring yogurt here and I can sell to these people. So if somebody says no, like, oh, why are you saying no? Sit down, relax, yeah? As long as everyone else is eating the yogurt, things are good. Right? So that's a concept which is being perpetrated in Africa right now, right? The neoliberal, actually in Kenya, we're being told every time if anything bad happens, you're told to accept and move on. As long as there's peace, there's stability, and we continue to enjoy our lives, we continue to enjoy our lives and put on our nice American clothes and UK clothes and drive our German cars, everything is okay, right? So this is a concept that the elite have learned and exacerbated by invoking the development narrative at every single time, where development means big infrastructural projects that put a smile in their pockets. Right? In Kenya, the politics of mega projects. If you see a big project in Africa, there's somebody somewhere eating something. Right? So this goes to my last part of this presentation, and this is the future. How does the future look like? So when I said, come back, we miss you, this is what I meant. right? So after all this, the Chinese and the US coming back and the UK coming back and all these things, so some other thing is happening is the, the realization of the financial instruments and the issuing of the sovereign bonds, right? So right now, the sovereign bond market is estimated to be in the upwards of 50 billion. So after exhausting the credit lines in China, like now you feel like, oh, we can't keep on going to borrow from the same person. Now I need to go and borrow someone else. So you go back to the colonialists, right? You start issuing Eurobonds, and that has become the fashion in Africa. Like in 2018 alone, so far, and we are only in March, right? Um, Egypt, Kenya, Senegal, Nigeria have issued $10 billion worth of sovereign bonds, right? So this is pure auctioning of their countries, right? So you're living on debt to debt. Like you get debt from China, you get debt from you go to and these euro bonds, they are very, actually they are oversubscribed, right? Because for if you know a little bit of finance, their yields are very high, right? Their yields are quite high because if you compare with other bonds in the markets, the African yields are very high, 8%, 8.5%. And like in Kenya, I think like 60 or 70% of the bond, we took a 2 billion, I think. It is a $2 billion bond. I think 60 or 80% of it went towards repaying a previous bond that we had taken. So you see now you are in a circle. There's nowhere you're going. So we're talking about the future. Where are we going? Where is this going to? So you're just calling for help. Hey, I'm drowning, come and help me. Hey, I'm drowning, come and help me. So here we are. Come back, we miss you. Right? We're going back to the person who oppressed us. Now we are borrowing money from them to pay to a Chinese who we invited very happily, and all other loans. So with the current trend of economic colonialism and African elites auctioning their countries to loans they cannot repay, several things seem poised to occur, or some of them have occurred. So one, high default rates and loss of sovereignty, like in Mozambique. Mozambique, actually, it's a very funny case. They issued a bond in the international markets known as tuna bond. The tuna bond was supposed to they're supposed to construct trawlers for fishing into the Indian Ocean. But I think it never materialized because most of these loans are taken to fund white elephant projects. So now they defaulted on their loan. So the IMF previously had given them a clean bill of health, and they were left with an egg on their eye because they were left with an egg on their head because Mozambique could not pay their loans. Now it had to be restructured. So another thing that happened, or I think we might see another thing happening, is like the Chinese okayed peaceful takeovers, like in Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe was peacefully overthrown after the general who had a trip to China. People say that he had gone to seek an okay from China to overthrow Mugabe. And then we have the reintroduction of conditional facilities. So we're going back to it, right? We're not getting out of this thing, right? So we have the sad truth is that it's our African leaders who are putting us in this, right? It's not the white man here. It's our African, and these ones are the people who betrayed the dream of Pan-Africanism. The people who took part in the coups and all that, and now they are in a situation whereby they are auctioning their own country, yeah, without thinking twice. Like now there's the reintroduction of conditional facilities. Like Kenya has an overdraw facility with IMF, and it was negotiated, I think, last month or this month. early this month, late last month, early this month. It was renegotiated, and some of the conditionalities is that we need to have a VAT to be charged on the fuel. So you see now that one is going to affect the common citizen, right? And it's a condition, it's an external condition which we didn't need that, but because of the sorry state of the affairs of the economy and all that, things are happening like that. So we're going back to the structural adjustment programs. So that's why I'm saying, come back, we missed you. It seems we never learned. We're going back to where we were. So, and finally, with those heavily capital intensive funded projects, if you can't pay for them, what do? Sri Lanka gave out its port to the Chinese because they can't pay it back. So I think, and us guys, we have a railway which we never needed, but we took money from the Chinese. They built for us a railway just parallel to the old railway, which we could have just upgraded. But this new railway didn't have any economic sense, right? As many pundits have said and many economists have said, it didn't have any economic sense. And now we're struggling to force everyone on that railway so that it can at least be able to pay for itself, of which it will still not pay for itself. Right? So what happens in that situation whereby you can't pay for your own project? You become hopeless, right? Because you can't keep on borrowing. You can't keep on going for the Euro bonds. You can't keep on going for the tuna bonds. You can't keep on going to the same person who you owe to give me more money. I'll pay you when I get more money. It won't work, right? So with that, I finish my presentation and I invite any questions or any discussions. Thank you.